People confuse what we're doing with pushing an agenda. No, we're actually doing the opposite. We're trying to prevent any agendas from being pushed. We want kids to learn, we want teachers to provoke thought, and we want kids to reach their own conclusions. But you can't do that when you have someone in an authority figure that is pushing down that agenda, whether it be in the K-12 space or in our universities, where you talk to these students, they're afraid of how it's going to hamper their grades if they say something that is in disagreement with the professors.
Welcome back to the Kevin Roberts Show. Here I am in Arizona at an education conference. We have really all the important education leaders in this country, which is to say real visionaries who are thinking about the future of American education that best fits each American child. I mean, that ultimately is what we should believe in. And one of them is someone I've gotten to know as a friend over the last few years. He's the Commissioner of Education for the great state of Florida, Manny Diaz. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, my pleasure. Great to be here with you.
You know, when I first met you, Heritage was giving Florida an award for education freedom in Florida. And since that time, Florida continues to be a leader. We're going to cover that in the episode. But before, even though I'm really tempted to start with this, we get into all of the great things going on with education in Florida, but also the challenges facing American education writ large. I'm really curious about your own story. Because when we met during a downpour, a thunderstorm in Florida, you mentioned that you had recently made the transition from being in the Florida State Senate to being Florida's Commissioner of Education. How is it that you found yourself, first of all, in politics, and then not just leading a state's education department, but a really important state for those of us who are interested in policy innovation?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. Actually, I played college baseball, and I decided I wanted to continue to be involved with athletics, which led me to teaching. And I loved history, so I ended up teaching, becoming a social studies teacher. And when I was 21, and then I ended up furthering my education and became a school administrator, and was in the public school system in Miami-Dade for 17 years. I would never say I got fully engulfed in it, as I was always a bit rebellious and saw things that I didn't like. And so that led me at one point to do something I never thought I would do, which is run for office. And my first run was for school board, which was a failed attempt. And you always remember those losses. When you have a candidate that's lost, you can tell in the way they react in their next elections. And so, because there are two ways to run, right? Scared or unopposed. And then that led me to fortunately getting elected to the Florida House in 2012, and then being able to chair education policy committees, was the appropriations chair for K-12 education in the Florida House. Then I went on to get elected to the Florida Senate, where I was the education policy chair. I got to the Senate at the same time that Governor DeSantis came in as governor, and was really built a strong relationship as an ally in the Senate, and really aligned on education policy. And we ended up, when the Commissioner of Education, Richard Corcoran, which was a former speaker, decided to move on, had the opportunity to take this challenge on. And for me, it was bittersweet leaving the legislature, but having the opportunity to be in this position to effectuate change year-round in Florida schools and education in Florida has been incredible.
And I imagine as Commissioner of Education, not only does your classroom experience help you out, I think that's pretty obvious to anybody, but also, especially in this time of conservative or at least common sense education reform, your experience in the legislature probably is invaluable for what you do day to day as Commissioner of Education.
Without a doubt. I mean, understanding, not only having the relationships in the legislature, but understanding the legislature itself. And what I like to say is, I spent so much time on educational policy, all of those policies, I end up now having to, you cook the meal, now I have to eat it, right? I have to implement these policies. And it's a different perspective, but understanding the legislative process, having those relationships really gives you a different view. And understanding that this position, which before my predecessor was highly bureaucratic, that during these times, it's important to have that political and legislative background to be able to understand the currents and understand where you need to engage. I think one of the problems we see across the country with some of my colleagues is that they're not willing to engage in the political conversation for whatever reason. And I think that's incredibly important in today's day and age, because if you don't communicate, if you don't strike back at falsities that are being put out there, it becomes the truth, right? And so you have to, in this position, be able to be in line with the governor's agenda and with the governor's principles, and be able to espouse them and communicate them, because at the end of the day, you're the tip of the spear in education.
We'll come back to this political lesson. It's also a little bit of a leadership lesson, which is the reticence, to be polite about it, by some members of legislatures or maybe even our Congress to really be bold in advocating for reform. But before we do that, I'm curious, at this point in your tenure as Commissioner of Education in Florida, what do you think has been your biggest achievement, and what has been your biggest challenge? They might even be the same thing.
Yeah, look, our biggest achievement is our biggest challenge, which is this movement to have these radical ideologies really introduced and implemented at our schools, and having the media and others tell us that it's not happening. And when you take the stance, the bold stance, like our Governor DeSantis has taken against these things, sometimes it's counterintuitive, because we talked about it. Sometimes, normally as a conservative, you want, local rule, you want the community. But when you see that there's a movement of these radical ideas going in to harm our kids, to harm our country, because these kids are the future of our country, you have to take action. And sometimes that action is going to cause, those arrows to come, or like our governor likes to say, when you're over the target, right? Because they're firing at you. And that's been, I think, the biggest achievement, is for us to be able to tackle that head on without fear, because of who the governor is, because I know that we have that support, being able to engage in that and fight that fight. At the same time, that's your biggest challenge, right? Because you're still trying to run a state Department of Education. There are still functions that you have to do. It's a $27 billion budget. And so how do you balance all of that and still make sure that there's quality education going on in the other facets without allowing this intrusion into our kids' lives?
So Manny, there are a lot of follow-up questions about discrete parts of your most recent answer I want to ask you, and I will. But maybe I'll pause here, because I've been wanting to ask you this question for a while. I don't think we've ever talked about this in the conversations we've had. What's your and Governor DeSantis's vision for education in Florida? Because once we set that vision, particularly in education, educator to educator, this is vital, then we can put in proper context why we're doing what we're doing, and then we'll get into some of the changes. But I'm curious about the vision, like the aspiration for education.
Look, the aspiration, I think there's a few major pillars that go with that, right? Number one, parents are the most important teacher and the child's first teacher, and ultimately are responsible for these kids. These kids don't belong to the government, they don't belong to the teacher, they don't belong to that school district, right? So you start with that, right? Second of all, when we talk about school choice, many people think they get confused. They think we're only talking about scholarships, or we're talking about charter. No, you have to identify the individual need of the student. How does that student flourish or succeed? And that runs the gamut, right? It goes from their elementary school to their junior high to high school to what they do after that. Every kid is not going to work out and go into a four-year institution and get a college degree. Some of them are going to go into trades. Some of them are going to get certificates. So laying out those opportunities across the board, and understanding that our education system was not founded, public education doesn't mean that it's a government-run school. It means that it's available to the public. And whatever way we put that out there, whatever fits the need of that child and that family, is the way we should be doing things. And ultimately, at the end of the day, going back to the core, how do we educate our kids to be well-rounded, civic-minded, and civically prepared members of our society? Because at the end of the day, the reason we started public education in this country is to help uphold our republic. And so if you put those three pillars in place, that's your North Star. That guides you. And all of the other stuff is nonsense. And we need to keep the nonsense, the ideologies, the agendas out of our school. People confuse what we're doing with pushing an agenda. No, we're actually doing the opposite. We're trying to prevent any agendas from being pushed. We want kids to learn. We want teachers to provoke thought. And we want kids to reach their own conclusions. But you can't do that when you have someone in an authority figure that is pushing down that agenda, whether it be in the K-12 space or in our universities, where you talk to these students, they're afraid of what grades, how it's going to hamper their grades if they say something that is in disagreement with the professors. So you take those three pillars, I think that answers your question.
Yeah, and I can't think of an education leader and a governor like you and Governor DeSantis who have been more effective, who have been bolder on all of that, but particularly on fighting back against the scourge of so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Right.
As y'all like to say rather famously, Florida is where DEI goes to die.
Yep.
And Heritage not only supports that, but has been very proud to develop partnerships with the two of you on that. What are some of the highlights of the achievements of pushing back on that agenda? And this comes from, obviously, a friend, but also a friend, as you know, who, as I am, happens to be a historian of race.
Right.
And who would be the last person, as you would be and Governor DeSantis would be, to say we have to whitewash history.
No, agreed.
So we're going to get in a little bit into some of the criticisms.
Right. So, well, first of all, with the DEI issue, if you don't need, you don't, even at its purest form, you don't need it, because if you look at Florida schools, look at our universities, there are some of the most diverse universities in the country. You don't have to try to do that. Students shouldn't be judged by their race, color, or creed, or their background. What is their character? What are their academic achievements? What are their contributions outside of academics to the overall program? And if you look at our universities, it naturally happens. You don't have to try to force it. It happens. And I think, when you talk about we can't whitewash history. We have to talk about the most difficult parts. And the criticisms come when someone decides to politicize or take something and try to turn it into a political issue, when in fact you're actually trying to put together the most honest, unvarnished truths about what happened in our past. And look, we don't have a perfect past, right? Our country has gone through many tumultuous times, has gone through horrors like slavery, Jim Crow laws, all of that discrimination. But to turn around and say that just because someone looks a certain way or a certain skin color or they come from a certain place, that they automatically have to be pegged with this is the way they think. That is incredibly destructive to our society. Again, I go back to main premise. Let's judge people by who they are individually, by their character and how they act. Let's not judge them by somebody who may have done something that may have looked like them, 100 years ago.
And a couple of outlets at the national level, which shall remain nameless, but no doubt the audience can conjure up who they might be, have just sent a seemingly endless volley of baseless attacks on you, on your department, on the governor, on education in Florida. Generally, you all have responded to those very well. But far more important than a couple of ivory tower elites who are keyboard warriors of the New York Times, I named one of them, are the parents of Florida,
right?
Who are your ultimate bosses. What's their response to this effort?
Look, the parents' response has been, again, going back to the three pillars, what they want is that. They want their kids to be able to go to school, have core knowledge, and not have some kind of agenda pushed on them from either side. I mean, they need to have unvarnished history. If you teach and provide the information, those students, we underestimate them. They're going to get to the conclusions on their own as long as you're providing them the ability to have access to the information, and you let the debate, you let the civil discussion go on. And I think that's something that, unfortunately, in society we're lacking now. If you are able to talk to each other and have those conversations, and everybody doesn't get so sensitive the minute you broach a subject, let's have those conversations. We're better off when we do.
And there's a political lesson in that, a leadership lesson, which I referenced a little while ago. And it seems to me, tell me if you think I'm mistaken, that without being gratuitous about it, be bold. Not just stand up for what you believe in, but be willing to articulate it and know that when you do that, when you're over the target, as your governor likes to say, you're going to get flack. But ultimately, the absence of that flack tells you you may not be being bold enough. Do you continue to see that problem I'm not asking you to name specific legislators, maybe not even be specific to Florida, but in the political realm, that is to say, we need more politicians willing to stand up like you and the governor have.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the problem from my legislative experience and from watching the governor and the way that he operates is you have a finite time. There's term limits, right? You go through hell to get elected, right? You get there, and if you're gonna spend your entire time just appeasing or trying not to do something that's going to get you unelected because you think it's too bold, even though it's the right thing, 8 years goes by and you look back and you've done nothing. I'm proud of my legislative career because I was in a tough seat originally before redistricting in the House, and I always thought, listen, people know who they elected. This is the stance I'm taking, especially when it came to school choice, when it wasn't so popular, right? When the teachers union narrative was kind of winning. It's like, take those bold steps because you have a finite time to have an effect. And if you're there to be somebody, then you're there for the wrong reasons. Be there to do something and do something for the right reasons. Be bold and don't be afraid of your next election. If you're spending your entire time being worried about your next election, you're already unelected and you don't know it.
Thank you for that. Let's take a little bit of time to talk about some specific policies, reforms that you've done at the K through 12 level. Clearly, Florida leads in education freedom. You have, with great fanfare, including from us, also focused on curriculum. And I home in on that, Manny, because one of my criticisms of the conservative education reform movement, and to some extent this is a self-criticism of my own work several years ago, was being totally focused on universal school choice, for example, but forgetting that there are at least three parts to education. There's that funding mechanism, which could be universal school choice, ought to be. There's the supply, which would include the delivery. But then there's also this piece that, for whatever reason, most of the time, conservatives, common sense people have just not paid attention to, maybe because they just assume that teachers know it all and they're going to get it right. Y'all have really homed in on that with great credit, which you deserve. What remains to be done in Florida to get schools to where you would say they're at an A+?
So you look, that work is never done. It's continuous.
The nature of education.
If you are not on, the best defense is to go on offense, right? And to get back to that core knowledge, right? To get back to that core mission, I think the things that are left to be done is something we're looking at right now. We just had legislation passed. The governor hasn't signed it yet, but is to restructure and reformat our schools of education. What are we teaching our teachers to teach? We should be focusing on the science of reading, right? How do we teach kids how to read? Because we got to, there's a great amount of kids that still don't know how to read in this country. We're not on grade level. Teaching math, the science of teaching. Instead, we found that in a lot of these programs, you had, again, these ideologies where they said, this is not content, this is methods, right? And you're putting in all of these, whether it be critical race theory or gender theory or all of that, into a teacher education program. That doesn't belong in there. And I think getting that out, not to be confused with strategies of teaching diverse populations, right? You need to understand the background of your students to be able to reach them. Different backgrounds require different strategies. That doesn't mean that you're teaching CRT or that you're teaching that, oppressors versus oppressed, or all of this stuff. And I think that's one thing we need to hone in on to make sure that the folks that we're putting into the classroom, number one, it's our responsibility that they're fully prepared to teach. This is what their job is. And number two, that we get all of the nonsense out of that classroom where it doesn't belong. Look, if somebody wants to go into a graduate program and study critical race theory or other theories, that's more power to them. But the folks that are going in to teach our K-12 students need to be prepared to teach and know those methods. And that should never be mixed with these other things from the outside. And so I think that's one place where we continue to do work and improve on that. And the continued work on curriculum, that's a nonstop job because we've taken the arrows on that. Every time that we have a textbook adoption and we have a lot of these materials that are not acceptable and we push back on the publishers and they try to leverage us because they're the publishers, we say, no, this is Florida. We are the ones, the legislature and the governor are the ones who decide what the curriculum is, what goes into our K-12 schools. You're not going to come here and dictate to us what's going to go into our children's classrooms. And so those two items, I think, will continue to have work going forward. We've taken the first steps, but now we really need to continue to dig in. And then at the higher ed level, I think there's a continuation of the work. You mentioned the DEI work. I think more work needs to be done to continue to have the ability to have that viewpoint diversity on campuses. Universities are supposed to be a place where you debate, you argue, you find yourself right, but you can't have that if you're only having a one-sided argument, or if that's being pushed upon you by someone who holds a grade over you, right? That requires continued work to make sure. We're not telling them what to think. What we're saying is this should be an open forum. There should be debates. And when you see some of these conservative speakers come onto campuses in different places and being shouted out, how is that diversity of viewpoint? You know what? You want to have a debate. A lot of them are going to be willing to debate you as a student. Have a conversation. Doesn't mean you can't disagree. It just means you have to be civil about it. And I think the continuation of making sure that our higher ed institutions do that and provide that opportunity for our students, we owe that not only to our students and our future and our country, we owe that to our taxpayers.
Let's talk a little more about higher ed. A lot of our audience members will be familiar with the story of New College. Yeah. Tell us what the rationale is there and how it's going.
Well, the rationale, first of all, is it was an institution that almost got shut down by the legislature a couple years before and annexed back into one of the existing institutions. And that's because it had lost its way. It was supposed to be the liberal arts honors college of Florida, smaller classes, the ability to do what I just mentioned, have those discussions, it just turned into an ideological place where that wasn't going on. Not only that, but the quality had gone down. And so you take former Speaker Corcoran, he's there as the president, he's moving that school in that direction. One of the interesting things, there was an article in that same publication that I read. No, I think it was a different publication, but they talked about how the infusion of athletes onto the campus was starting to change the culture, and they were talking about that like it was a bad thing. And I'm thinking in my head, when you have diversity of viewpoints and diversity of backgrounds on these campuses, that produces a better ecosystem for learning, because now you have. And I'm not talking about race, color, or creed. I'm talking about the fact that you have a student who's a student athlete as opposed to a student who is strictly academic or goes to school and goes to work and doesn't there's a mix there of experiences. The adversity that is created, right, when you're an athlete, you got to go through tough times. It's real life. It mimics real life. So you have success, you have failure, you have adversity. You have to pull through that. I think the injection of that is ingenious because it brings a different perspective onto the campus. And when you have students who are athletic and at the same time high academic achievers, it creates a different atmosphere that I think benefits other students, just like those athletes are going to benefit from the other students that are on that campus. So it's a work in progress. You're seeing that, but you're seeing the opposition from the other side, right? That you're trying to destroy this campus, that you're trying to somehow politicize it. No, it's going back to really a core classical learning model, which is let students learn, right? The classical liberal arts, let them form their own opinions and let them go out into the world and find their way with that. That gives them a foundation where they can really go anywhere from there.
And if anything, the whole effort has been to depoliticize what's going on at New College.
That's the ironic part, right? Is when all the headlines say you're politicizing it, but it's really going the other way, trying to get it to neutral where it's this ecosystem where you can have all kinds of conversations. And at the end of the day, something that needs to be mentioned is that's a public school. It's being funded by the taxpayers of Florida. We should demand excellence in output. We shouldn't be taking taxpayer dollars and putting it into something that is not producing outputs that match the demands and the needs of our state.
So let's ever so slightly shift gears into teacher Manny Diaz giving some homework assignments to our audience. Imagine we have parents in the audience, which no doubt we do, and they're looking for advice from you, given your varied experience here, on school selection, questions to ask their principal, their school board. We're going to posit that everyone's going to be polite
Right.
but firm. Their greatest gift, of course, is their kids, which they know, so they're going to go fight for them. Questions to ask about curriculum. But most importantly, Manny, one of the things we try to do in the show is give people some action steps where when they see a problem or they see an opportunity, like you've outlined, the opportunities in education, they want to be part of it. But maybe they only have time for one or two things. What advice do you give them on A, how to be involved with their own children's lives and education, and B, if they are so inclined, how they might be involved in a little bit larger way?
Yeah, well, number one, and I know that everybody doesn't have the same time opportunity, right? Because in a perfect world, you would have parents involved at school, where I've seen schools where you have, from the lunch program to the athletic program it's actually the parents are involved and it becomes a community. I mean, that's the ideal situation. As much as you can involve yourself at the school in one of those roles, where it doesn't mean you're teaching, right? But it means you're coming in and helping with field trips. You're coming in and helping with extracurricular activities or lunch, especially with younger children. Be involved, because when you are there, you're going to get a feel for what is going on, and it doesn't take long. You're going to figure out pretty quick. Not only that, the school will act a different way when you have all those parents in there. It keeps them in check. It's not because they have nefarious reasons, although sometimes there may be, but most of the time it's because it's just human nature. When you have parents there who are the ones either paying tuition, either via taxpayer dollars, private school, or whatever it may be, those are going to be the constituents that are holding that school accountable to make sure that it is, if you chose that school for a certain mission or because of programming, that you're holding them accountable to make sure that they are actually fulfilling that mission. And when you go to a school, you need to sit down with the leadership. You need to speak to the person that's in charge of the curriculum. You need to speak with the principal or headmaster and get a feel for what is the mission, what is the leadership style, because there's two factors that affect schools, only two factors: the leadership and the quality of the teacher standing at the front of the classroom. Those are the two factors. You could literally be outside under a tree. If you have those two factors, kids are going to learn. And so it's very telling that when you're able to speak to the leader and speak to the teachers that are going to be teaching your kid, and make sure your values align. Make sure the programming aligns to the needs of your child. We've had families I've spoken to that have 4 kids. They go to 4 different schools because each kid it's not a collective. It's an individual kid. And so even from the same family, they have different needs, whether it be extracurricular activities or whether it be the curriculum or the setting or the pace or however it is. You're gonna need to do what's best for your individual child. So my suggestion is that you go in and speak to the leadership, if you're able to speak to those teachers and really get a sense for who the people are and what they're thinking, right? What their goals are.
What do you say relatedly to parents, but it's often grandparents, is I hear the complaint that their child or grandchild is in a university, and they're in a university that they thought was at least okay. Maybe they even thought it was common sense, but their child or grandchild is just beset in class after class with course content that is un-American, it's not factual, it's way overly biased. What do we say to them, and how do we fix that on a national scale?
So that is in my opinion, one of the biggest problems we're facing in this country, is because our universities have become something else. And I think there's several reasons for it. There's outside influences, whether it be through outside donors, even from outside of the country, that have a certain agenda, or whether it be the professors that have a certain agenda, or the leadership may have a certain agenda. How do you think? I mean, look, when you're choosing a school, I think you need to do deep research, because it's not what the brochure always says, right? It's not the glossy brochure. You need to really figure out how that's going to affect your child. And look, some students go in there and it doesn't faze them, right? They just become more entrenched in their values and their thoughts, right? Because they believe it. But not everybody has that opportunity. So I think it's important for parents to help students choose institutions that really are going to fit their values and their needs. And how do you do that? That's tough research, because everything's glossy, everything's a marketing and a sales pitch, right? how do we fix it in the country? I think we need to, first of all, in Florida, we did some of this under the governor's leadership when he first came in. His first thing we did is get rid of all the Confucius Institutes, right? You can't have your economic and geopolitical enemy influencing your future leaders of government, companies, you name it, in your country. I think that's a big problem. Number two, what we've done in Florida, which is impose tenure review. Just because a professor has been there for a long time, if they're not being productive, they're not producing research, if they're not doing what they need to do, they need to be held accountable. All of us are held accountable in one way or another. Why does it mean that if you go into academia, you can just be there and not have any of these measures or metrics because you've reached tenure? And so I think that's the start. Then we have to dig into the funding that comes from the states, and the states realizing, legislatures and governors realizing that they're holding their purse strings and they're funding these schools, and they do have the ability to demand, and they have to have the bold courage, like our governor has had and our board of governors, to say to accreditors, we're not going to just take what you're selling us, and tell the federal government, the U.S. Department of Education, we're just not going to take what you're telling us. These are our students, these are our schools, our taxpayers fund them. We have the ability to set the tone here. And I think when you start by that, that's the low-hanging fruit, right? I think you start to look at, how do you get our institutions back to producing, right? How do we get students to go, students that belong and that want to go into a 4-year university track, how do we put them in a situation where that investment is worthwhile when they get out of school? And I'm not saying that everything has to be a career path directly, because there is value to a liberal arts, proper liberal arts, well-rounded education. There are soft skills. A lot of people end up either changing careers or they get other credentials, right? But if you go into some of these things like gender studies, like, the taxpayers are paying for this. I mean, if you want to send your student to a private university that does that and pay out of your pocket, the problem is that's not happening. We're funding it from the federal government, or they're being saddled with debt. And so what does that do? Naturally, increases the price, right? We wonder why tuition keeps going up across the country.
And in so many cases, as is the case with gender studies, on programs that undermine our entire way of thinking. So building on that, this is going to be a little bit different version of the magic wand question. Usually what I do with this question, Manny, is I figuratively hand a magic wand for policy reform to our guest. But in this case, I'm going to be selfish and hold on to the magic wand and say, because the question was going to be, what one change do you make in education? I'm going to hold on to the magic wand. And no surprise to this audience, I'm going to eliminate the U.S. Department of Education, which is my number one goal as a policy leader. It's the number one goal of the Heritage Foundation. And we believe it's going to happen. So I've just waved the magic wand. What does education look like, given your experience, if that happens?
The responsibility goes back to the states where it belongs. And number one. Number two, when you say eliminate, there's different forms of that, right? Because you remove it as a cabinet position. I think you take their rule-making authority away. And if they have to remain as a pass-through for these title programs, Title I, II, which we know are not going to go away, right? But doesn't allow them to put these extra strings on these programs. Let the states decide what they're going to do with their education. And whether it be a blue state or a red state, I don't care. If you're sending them Title I dollars that are supposed to be for low-income students to improve, send it down to the state and let the state decide what they're going to do with that money. Don't continue to put these strings. So you don't need it to be a cabinet position. It's basically a pass-through processing agency that would allow those dollars to flow out to the states in an organized manner and make sure that the states are using the dollars, right, but without all these strings attached. And I think you end up with better educational outcomes. The other thing is, there's a second piece to this, is you get them out of deciding who they're going to say are the accreditors for higher ed, right? Which it's been a huge monopoly. And now the Biden administration is trying to go back. Betsy DeVos under Trump removed that and said, we're going to allow you to go, no more regional. You can go to any accreditor that fits you. Well, they're trying to peel that back. And I think by removing that monopoly, why does the U.S. Department of Education get to make that decision? Sure, you could have standards, you could have metrics, but you can do that with another organization that just is like we do in other things, right? Quality control, people can go and look. I think a great example of what can work is what you see at Hillsdale College, right? They don't take one government dollar, yet look how successful they are in their education programs without one government dollar. It can work without driving up the price. So I see that. I think that's the second piece there is that administration or that monopoly. Now, the question becomes, what do you do with the student loan piece? I think it could be managed out of a reduced department. You don't need all those people there. You certainly don't need to be a cabinet position, and you definitely don't need them to have rulemaking authority.
Yeah, what a thorough answer. Thank you for that. And what we've suggested at the Heritage Foundation is on some of the very few legitimate purposes of the Department of Education. For example, legitimate civil rights issues.
Right.
Department of Justice can handle that.
Right.
Obviously, the DOJ needs some reform too, but it's not going away.
Right.
As one of the original cabinet departments in the Constitution. So we'll do this again for sure because you'll have more stories to tell about Florida. But I'll ask you one final question for now for today's episode, and it's the final question that I ask most guests. I'm really curious to hear your answer. But it's going to be sort of education specific. Ultimately, it's about why you woke up hopeful about the American future. But I want you to imagine you're addressing a grandparent somewhere in Middle America. Maybe they're somewhere in Florida, but we'll just say Middle America, who says, Manny, thank you for everything you've done in Florida. Thank you for your leadership. Everything is going great in Florida, it seems. But where I live, what my kids and their kids are facing in their school seems irreversible. And the plight of education in my community, this person would say, tells me that America's best days are behind it, not in front of it. How do you respond?
Well, listen, America is the greatest country on the face of the earth, and we've gone through cycles and faced tough times before. This is nothing new. It may seem like it's worse than any time before because you have social media, 24-hour news cycles, all those things, but the American fabric and the American spirit is still there. And as long as we have people that are willing to fight, to push back, and clearly those people are around, and they're now in tune to the fact that this is going on. Anytime one side pushes too far, I think you see the revolt from the other side. And I think that part of that is what Heritage does, right? And some of the leaders across the country, some of our governors and legislators and other leaders, I think the pushback is happening, and you're seeing it in the form of the revolt with school choice and all of the states that are now passing universal ESAs, which 10 years ago we would have never thought was going to happen, correct? So I think you're seeing the response. The problem is it's easy to become a pessimist because all you read in the media is the other way, right? It goes the other way. But I think we have to have confidence in the American spirit and the American people, and even with the new generation, as much as people like to push, pound on millennials, right, and be. But I think you're seeing that new generation is actually starting to wake up to a rationale that, wait a minute, I've seen what's gone on. If I just look back a little further in this country to our history, to the times when it was better, what were the things we were doing, and why don't we get back to some of that? And I think that is what provides our hope that American spirit's not going away. Sometimes it goes through a hiccup in a certain generation, and I think we've seen that. And I think obviously social media, all of that has had an effect on it. But I'm an optimist, so I do think the American spirit is there, and I do think at some point, just don't stop fighting. Continue to look for leaders and support leaders who are willing to take on that fight.
Manny Diaz, Florida's exceptional Commissioner of Education. Thanks for doing that.
Thank you.
Hope you enjoy that conversation. It is obviously a source of great hope to see not only what's going on in Florida and in other states, but that regardless of where you live, regardless of how pessimistic you might be, maybe realistic about the education in your community, that it can be fixed, and in fact, it will be fixed. Keep your chin up. We're winning. America remains a great country.
The Kevin Roberts Show is brought to you by more than 500,000 members of the Heritage Foundation. The executive producer is Crystal Kate Bonham. The producer is Philip Reynolds. Sound design by Lauren Evans, Mark Guiney, and Tim Kennedy. For more information and to subscribe, please visit heritage.org.